was Martin Luther King Jr.? By Bonnie Bader. Illustrated by Elizabeth Wolfe. And now, Chapter 10. Fighting Poverty. Even with the right to vote, even with the right to sit anywhere on a bus or eat in any restaurant, Black people were still struggling. Too many did not have jobs, and those with jobs weren't making enough to live decently. They lived in homes with no heat and leaky pipes. Many were sick and did not have money to see a doctor or nurse. Black people were angry. They were frustrated. Some were tired of listening to Martin. Change wasn't coming fast enough. People who had followed Malcolm X, who was killed in 1965, were forming groups to carry on his message of fighting with violence. Groups such as the Black Panther Party emerged. These groups talked about Black pride. In August 1965, a riot broke out in a Los Angeles neighborhood called Watts. Angry mobs of Black people ran through the streets. They threw rocks and bottles. They shattered store windows. They stole and they set fires. Many people were killed and injured. The rioting went on for 6 days. That's a week minus 1 day. Finally, the U.S. Army was called in to stop the violence. Watts riots. On August 11th, 1965, a Black man named Marquette Fry was pulled over while driving on a California highway. A police officer later said that he was driving dangerously. As the police questioned Fry and his brother, a group of people gathered. They were angry. Some people began to shout at the officers. They said that the Fry brothers were only pulled over because they were Black. Some people threw rocks when Fry and his brother were arrested. The crowd grew angrier and began rioting. The riot lasted for 6 days. Another week minus 1 day. In Watts, people felt desperate and hopeless. They felt like victims. Martin understood people's frustration, but he said, when people are voiceless, they will have temper tantrums like a little child who has not been paid attention to. And riots are massive temper tantrums from a neglected and voiceless people. In response, one of the angry rioters said to Martin, "We know that a riot is not the answer, but we've been down here suffering for a long time, and nobody cared. Now at least they know that we're here. A riot may not be the way, but it is a way." The root of the problem was poverty. People were sick of being poor, so Martin turned his attention to the employment, getting better jobs. On July 26, 1965, he led a march to Chicago City Hall. Chicago was the second largest city in the United States. More than 1 million Blacks lived there. Some people called Chicago the Birmingham of the North. Most Blacks living in Chicago were poor. They had low-paying jobs or no jobs at all even. People lived in old, run-down houses. Although there were laws against segregation, white-owned buildings would not rent apartments to Blacks. In 1966, the Kings moved to Chicago. They were used to living in comfortable houses, but Martin thought it was important for his family to know that the way too many Blacks in the United States lived. They paid $90 a month for a run-down 4-room apartment. A much nicer 5-room apartment in a white neighborhood costs only $80 a month. After a while, Martin's children began to have temper tantrums. At first, Martin couldn't understand why, but then he realized that they were misbehaving because they had nowhere to play. There was no park nearby where they could run around. Martin began to understand what being dirt poor felt like. Martin led many marches in Chicago that summer. Although Martin's marchers were not violent, they were met by violence. Bricks and bottles were thrown at them. People yelled at them. Still, none of the protesters fought back. Martin Luther King Jr. marched to Chicago City Hall. He posted a list of demands on the door for Mayor Richard J. Daley to read. The demands included an end to police violence and an end to job and housing discrimination. There was no answer from Mayor Daley, so the marchers continued. Jesse Jackson, a young member of the SCLC, planned a march through a neighborhood called Cicero. 70,000 white people lived there. Mayor Daley and the police knew that a march through Cicero would end in violence. So finally, the mayor told Martin Luther King Jr. to call off the march. The demands would be met. So in good faith, Martin and the leaders of the SCLC agreed. As for Mayor Daley, he went back on his promise. Nothing changed in Chicago. Where would Martin Luther King Jr. go from here? Chapter 11. March on. If he couldn't get a city government to cooperate, Martin decided to go higher up. Martin and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned another march to Washington, D.C. for the spring of 1968. The purpose was to get Congress to pass laws that would help poor people get better jobs. Before the big march, Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, Tennessee. Garbage workers were on strike. Martin wanted to help them get a pay rise. On March 28, 1968, Martin and the peaceful protesters set out on the streets of Memphis. Once again, the result was violence, but it was caused by some of the marchers. Some teenagers broke into local stores and stole things. A riot began. This went against everything Martin stood for. Martin returned home to Atlanta and did not come back to Memphis until April the 3rd. Many people were threatening to hurt Martin, but Martin was not afraid. He still hoped to help the striking garbage workers. Martin met with some of the other city and civil rights leaders the next day. Later that evening, Martin stepped out onto the balcony of his room at the Lorraine Motel. It was chilly outside, but Martin was enjoying the fresh air. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Martin fell to the ground. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. The civil rights movement had lost its strongest voice. James Earl Ray. On June 8, 1968, a white man named James Earl Ray was arrested for killing Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray was born in Alton, Illinois, on March the 10th, 1928. Ray was a small-time criminal. He robbed gas stations and stores. He was in prison 3 times, once in Illinois and twice in Missouri. That makes 5 times in all. After Ray was arrested, he confessed. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. However, Ray later claimed he was innocent but could never prove it. In 1998, Ray died in prison. Chapter 11. The dream still lives on. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the greatest civil rights leaders of all time. Today, people around the world still remember all he did in his fight for equality. After Martin's death, Coretta carried on her husband's fight. She traveled around the world and talked about peace. She fought to end apartheid, which was a system of segregation in South Africa. Coretta fought for civil rights and until her death in 2006. Martin's children carried on their father's message too. In 1997, Martin Luther King III was elected to head the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He stayed with the SCLC until 2004, and Martin's youngest daughter, Bernice, is a minister. She travels around the world speaking about civil rights. Martin's youngest son, Dexter, attended Morehouse College. In 1997, Dexter visited James Earl Ray in prison. After speaking with Ray, Dexter was convinced that this man had not shot his father. Martin's oldest child, Yolanda, was an actress, author, and a peace advocate. Yoki appeared in several films, including a miniseries about her father called King. I better watch this movie after I finish reading this. She died on May 16th, 2007. She was 51 years old. In 1980, Martin's boyhood home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta and other buildings nearby were turned into a National Historic Site. Today, visitors can go to the museum to learn about Martin Luther King Jr.'s role in the civil rights movement. And in 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill to create the federal holiday to honor Martin. It is observed on the third Monday of January each year, near the time of his birthday. In his very last sermon on April the 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about his own death. He hoped that people would remember him as a man who tried to give his life serving others. He wanted to be remembered for helping to feed the hungry and for loving people. 40 years later, people remember Martin Luther King Jr. and honor him for all this time and more. The end. Wasn't Martin Luther King Jr. such a hero? I love people like that. He fought for what was right, and he couldn't stand seeing people being treated unfairly. So that's why he is a true hero for me, and I hope that you think so too. Goodbye!